Good morning, friends. We're on Chapter 9, A New Dawn. After the rebels' victories, many of Rakah's residents fled to the countryside, afraid of regime bombs, their new overlords, and the unknown. Of those who remained, many were swept up in the generosity and the participatory ethos of those early days of revolution. For the first few weeks, people treated each other more kindly than usual, as if bolstered by some mixture of independence, relief, and pride. Despite the efforts of the first aerial bombardment in its history, the city still looked bright and hopeful. In the eyes of many of those who stayed, Rakah had liberated itself by its own hands. When I was not tutoring kids in English to earn my living, I wrapped my neck in a scarf patterned like the revolutionary flag, sewn by Nail's mom, and took a cab to central Rakah. In the city center, activists painted every surface they could reach with revolutionary black, red, white, and green. Graffiti screamed from every wall, first battalion names and Islamist slogans, then calls for freedom and democracy, logos for various activist groups, and mockery of Ghassan Hito, the first prime minister of the Syrian opposition's interim government in exile. Where are you, O Hito? We liberated Rakah for you. The interim government had just formed in March, and Hito had said that Rakah was qualified to host his cabinet's headquarters. The political opposition, however, remained in hotel suites in DC or Istanbul, earning it the deserved nickname the opposition of the hotels. During the rare minutes when I could connect to the internet, I tweeted descriptions of the general mood in these streets. I headed toward my uncle's cafe, which his relative Adham had recently reopened. As I was on my way to cross the bridge over the Euphrates, I passed the statue of a goddess holding her pot of bubbling water at the bridge's entrance, and to her base was tied a slim donkey. Someone had hung a picture of Bashar al-Assad around the donkey's neck and painted the president's name on its fur. Twilight was falling by the time I reached the cafe, and the light came in bronze sheets through its windows. In the corner, I spotted my friend Tamer, a gregarious graphic designer who had studied art alongside Nael in Damascus, engaged in an intense trialogue with two older men. He introduced them as fellow artists by the names of Rashed Nawas and Fadel Al-Ramo. Rashed, the calligrapher, with the twisted mouth never far from his pipe, of the tall, emaciated body with the white ponytail and the beard divided between dark and light. Fidel, the sculptor, of the mustache and the 1960s beret. The conversation turned to the rebels, Islamists and not, that were now running Rakah. Since I was a teenager, I had passed Fidel's sculptures in Basil Street. 6 abstract stone forms not quite as short as me. His work had endured war and airstrikes, but lasted a mere 10 days and liberated Rakah. To the Salafist rebels of Arar al-Asham, a sculpture was a brazen imitation of God's creation. This religious ruling applied solely to sculptures of living creatures, of course, but the Arar groupies were nonetheless intolerant of abstract art too. They squinted and stared until Fidel's mysterious stone shapes reminded them of people, which made them idols, meaning they had to be destroyed. Our armed revolutionaries smashed Fidel's work with bulldozers. There should be no place for Islamists in the city, Rashad believed. What we needed in Rakah were civil efforts that could form a base for secular governance. By now, however, both Rashed and Fidel knew that this idea had been defeated. Tamer turned to me. Have you heard of Hakuna? He asked. Hakuna was one of Rakah's many new activist groups. I'd seen its logo, a cartoon hand with its 2 fingers raised in victory, the index stamped with ink as if marked after casting a ballot. With increasing frequency during my trips into the city center, Hakuna was Arabic for our right to vote. Next to the logo, they wrote Hakuka, Hakuki, Hakuna, your right, masculine, your right, feminine, our right. Yeah, I've seen their posters around. Well, we've done some activities with them, said Tamer, trailing off while he cast glances toward Fidel and Rashed, who seemed reluctant to go into detail. Instead, Fidel began to speak about his cave, which he had carved himself in the mountains that separated Euphrates from desert. He had intended it to be his home, now he lamented those months of hard work. Islamism, he said, was spreading over public life, which, much like dandelion seeds swirling lazily in the breeze, and soon there would be no space for him, or any other artist, or any thinking secular human in this country. How repressive Islamists loomed in his eyes. To him, they were merely backward hindrances to Syria's future. Were it possible, he would clean them from the face of the earth. Those people you loathe represent the views of the majority, I argued. As he spoke, my thoughts circled back to the thing we all knew but would not say. We were an extreme minority within Raqqa. The values we held marked us, in the eyes of our neighbors, as dangerous, un-Islamic agents of the West. Grassroots, democracy, electoral rights, respect for the ballot box as a basis for representation and legitimacy. Could these words be more alien to most Syrians? Could these so-called universal values, the values my friends and I screamed for between our gas-choked curses at security officers, be far from universal indeed? Perhaps they are parochial mores speculated about in the university campuses of European capitals. Perhaps they are insubstantial as ghosts. Most Syrians were not politically well educated. How could they be with the death grip Baathism had on education, and with the margin the party left empty filled with loyalist clerics? People grew up loathing the word democracy without knowing its actual meaning. I once mentioned to my father that secularism was a necessary tool for progress. His face went red with rage. To him, secularism meant Ataturk, Turkey's secular father, and thus the repression of religious people. Under the weight of his disappointment, I stopped the conversation. Another friend accused me of being a liberal in the tone you would use to call someone a traitor. Ideas associated with the West have carried the air of hypocrisy since the partition of our countries by the civilized imperial powers, not to mention the invasion of Iraq. Always the West comes here, posturing about the protection of minorities, freedom, democracy, fair play. Always they carve up our countries, steal our resources, bomb our cities, and then wonder why the sweet words they mutter while doing so don't sound the same in our ears. In the eyes of many Syrians, so-called universal values were tools of a foreign agenda, aimed at the destruction of our society. This idea grew stronger after 2013, when Assad massacred 1,300 Syrians with chemical weapons in eastern Ghouta. When the international community ignored the victims of the Syrian regime, conspiracy theories flourished and Islamists filled the void. Superficially, Islamism appeared more genuine and intimate to most Rakkans' lives. As conservative but not particularly devout Sunnis, Rakkans related to the ideas that Islamists preached. They admired the Umayyad, Abbasid, and even the Ottoman caliphates. These vast, prosperous, and powerful empires seemed to offer solutions drawn authentically from our own glorious past. Flush with money from wealthy Gulf supporters, Syrian Islamists earned acceptance through military victory and self-promotion. The revolution mutated in their hands. They hijacked its language and recruited its fighters, but never, not even for a moment, wanted to achieve its goals. The revolution's three-starred flag was replaced by black banners. Graffitied words, democracy, nationalism, elections. Ooh. Sorry, friends. Elections were blotted out, covered by Quranic verses and hadiths that urged jihad to restore Sharia law. The preachers who had only recently concluded their Friday sermons with a prayer for God to grant Mr. President Bashar al-Assad the power and wisdom to make the decisions that will be to the benefit of the Muslim Ummah fled their mosques, and their pulpits were occupied by Salafists who prayed for God to grant the Mujahideen victories over Assad to the benefit of the same Muslim Ummah. In a ploy to survive, FSA battalions accommodated themselves to the new trend. They added Islamic references to their nationalist logos. They shoved their revolutionary speech to one side and made room for religious ideology. I sat with Rashid and Fidel for hours, passing from cappuccino to coffee to fruit juice to tea, and the conversation drifted to Nayel. The two men knew Nayel from the University of Damascus, where he had been 1 year short of graduation when he joined Arar al-Tabqa. Fidel begged him not to fight. Nayel left anyway, heedless of the pleas of his friends, his mother, his girlfriend, determined not to look back. Do you want me to continue my studies as if nothing is happening, as if people are not being massacred daily? He would ask. He took on this responsibility as his own. His past lay like old clothes behind him. Once Nayel would have sat with Rashid and Fidel, talking like them, thinking like them, instead of fighting on some front line. Nayel had once told me that if people like us left the country or the revolution, we would be abandoning it to fundamentalists and gangs. Ever since the protest, he had felt a responsibility to the country. He would never be like so many other revolutionaries, obsessed with guns, power, personal glory, or merely snatching an apartment left behind by a fleeing loyalist. And I, who shunned arms and shied away from collective action, took on a different responsibility. I would remain as my own. By the time Rashid, Fidel, and I drank our tea, the less religious brigades had already started to recede before the Islamist tide. Often broke, undisciplined, and disorganized, the independent militias who fought under the FSA umbrella cleared their own path to marginalization. Many of their leaders were warlords, infamous for looting governmental facilities. A rebel leader in Aleppo made millions renting tanks to other groups. The smaller fry confined themselves to setting up checkpoints to shake civilians down for bribes. In Raqqa, Abu Faraj's faction, which had inherited the Air Force intelligence checkpoint near the cafe, numbered a few dozen, with so few rifles that they had to rotate arms during shifts. Abu Faraj kept 3 Alawite prisoners locked underground in a former art gallery. The men, once guards at the National Hospital, had surrendered the moment they'd seen his group. Now they were chattel, worth $10,000 apiece in ransom. With the value of the kalash at $2,000, each guard was equal to 5 guns. Islamists stole too, of course, but they beautified their theft with decontextualized Quranic verses and hadiths, just as they wrapped their cigarette habits in black scarves and long beards. As soon as the rebels captured the city, Arar al-Sham looted 7 billion Syrian pounds from banks, including the Syrian Central Bank's Raqqa branch. The Jabhat al-Nusra guys, cruising the streets in branded pickup trucks, helped themselves to war booty, even plasma TVs. The joke went that a jihadi had only to say Allahu Akbar 3 times and a coveted object was his. Islamists were no less covetous of the public sphere, and soon they began to assert their dominance on the streets. An Arar fighter cocked his gun in my direction when I snapped pictures of one of the group's buildings and, fearing being geolocated, cried out that by taking the photos I had just fucked their mothers. During demonstrations, small groups of Islamist fighters hassled protesters. The Free Salafist Current denounced democracy and graffiti scrawled across Raqqa's ancient Abbasid walls. Rumors flew about activists. People said, without proof, that they grew fat on foreign funding, that they were out for some nebulous sort of personal gain. One Islamist group raided Hakuna's headquarters. Some Hakuna members did leave to disperse across Turkey, then farther into Europe. Others stayed despite the increasing danger. In July, they marched in front of Arar al-Sham's headquarters and screamed that Arar was the same as the regime they had fought against. By October, they had begun to disappear into ISIS jails. Fidel left Raqqa 3 months after our conversation. Despite the arrests, Rashid would stay, even when far worse masters took over Raqqa, even though he lost his wife and sons to the bombs that so many countries would soon see fit to drop upon us. A few weeks after the rebels took Raqqa, Nael was home, and I went to visit him. We sat in his family's living room where he smoked his usual Alhambra cigarettes over a cup of coffee his sister had served. He had bandaged his head with an old black kafaya and was going by the nom de guerre Abu Omar. Nael told me about the Khal who commanded Arar al-Tagba in the city. He was an agreeable, black-haired man whose entire military presence in Raqqa consisted of 30 men, an apartment in Masakan al-Hud, a villa in Harat el-Haramaya, 2 pickup trucks, and 1 minibus. The Khal had given Nael a job as accountant for their small battalion. The Khal appreciated what he had in Nael, wanting to keep him behind the lines. That's not why I joined the revolution, Nael said. I had never seen him so zealous and happy. His brothers and I barraged him with questions about battlefields, the groups, the regime, the backers. With patience and a smile, he answered them all. Our fears for him haunted the room, but his face was placid, peaceful. Nael was describing pandemonium at the front line. How once he didn't sleep for 2 consecutive days and had to stay garrisoned in the trench. How bullets whizzed over his head, how both sides were positioned so close that the rebels could mock regime fighters to their faces, then exchange fire with them. How a mortar had fallen nearby and wounded 2 of his friends. How they adapted to sleep on the battlefield. A car honked, and Nael's brother said that his friends had come to pick him up. He bade us farewell, and as we embraced, I spoke my last words to him. God preserve you. Have a good day, friends.